It usually starts with a thrill, a cheap scare, a game played in the dark, fingertips hovering over polished wood, a flimsy planchette sliding, spelling out words you can't quite believe are real. You giggle, maybe shiver, and then eventually you say goodbye. The session ends. But what if the story doesn't end? What if the door you pried open, even just a crack, refuses to latch shut? What if something slipped through? Something that found you interesting. Because in countless stories, told in hushed tones online, in forgotten local newspapers, and whispered across generations, the most disturbing details don't happen during the Ouija session. They happen after. Long after the board is packed away or even burned. They happen when you're alone in the quiet of your home, when the shadows stretch just a little too far, and the silence isn't quite empty. We're going to trace the chilling patterns of these after effects tonight. The slow, creeping horror that latches on, deepens, and changes everything. We're going to explore how a game can turn into a haunting, not with jump scares, but with an insidious dread that suffocates your very sense of reality. And by the end, you might just understand why some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Welcome to the Unveiled Darkness Podcast. I'm your host, and if you're new here, this is the place where we go deep into the stories that don't quite add up, the cases that got buried, the legends that refuse to die, and the darkness that keeps finding its way back to the surface. If that sounds like your kind of night, hit subscribe and make yourself comfortable. We're just getting started. Now, where were we? Our story tonight centers on a group of 3 friends, barely out of their teens, full of that specific blend of youthful bravado and underlying insecurity. Liam, Chloe, and Ben. This was a few years back, the tail end of a particularly hot, sticky summer in a small town called Oak Haven. Not really known for much beyond its annual pumpkin festival and a surprisingly well-stocked antique shop. It was in that antique shop, nestled between yellowed lace and chipped porcelain dolls, that Chloe found it. An authentic, turn-of-the-century Ouija board. Not a novelty store knockoff, but something heavy, with a patina of age that hinted at forgotten hands and whispered questions. The price tag was surprisingly low, almost too low, as if the owner just wanted it gone. Chloe, ever the thrill-seeker, convinced Liam and Ben that it would be fun, a harmless experiment. Liam, the pragmatic skeptic, rolled his eyes but eventually relented, intrigued despite himself. Ben, already prone to late-night anxieties, was reluctant but didn't want to be left out. A classic setup, wouldn't you say? The perfect trifecta of belief, doubt, and vulnerability. They chose a Friday night, predictably, at Liam's house. His parents were away for the weekend, leaving the old Victorian house creaking and groaning in the August heat. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant honeysuckle. They cleared Liam's living room coffee table, set out some candles that flickered nervously in the draft, and dimmed the lights. The shadows stretched long and indistinct, blurring the edges of familiar furniture. As they placed their fingertips on the planchette, the initial atmosphere was one of forced levity. Liam was making jokes, Ben was breathing a little too fast, and Chloe, her eyes wide, was murmuring questions to the silent room. The first few minutes were just that, silence. The planchette remained stubbornly still. Liam smirked, about to declare the whole thing a bust. And then, it moved. Just a fraction. A barely perceptible shift beneath their fingers.
A collective gasp, then a sudden tension that snapped the forced laughter out of the air. It glided slowly, deliberately, to the letter H, then E, then L, then L. Silence stretched. The candles seemed to dim. Ben practically whimpered. Liam, despite himself, felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. This wasn't a joke, not anymore. "Who are you?" Chloe whispered, her voice a thin thread in the sudden quiet. The planchette moved again, faster this time, darting around the board. Z-O-B-E. They stared at the word. Zob? They repeated it, trying to make sense of the syllables. It didn't sound familiar. It didn't sound friendly. Liam, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. Someone's pushing, he accused, looking from Chloe to Ben. Both shook their heads vigorously, their faces pale in the dim light. Ben's hand was trembling noticeably. The questions continued, haltingly at first. They learned that Zob claimed to be a young man, trapped, lonely. He answered personal questions about them with unnerving accuracy, details they hadn't shared with each other. He knew about Chloe's recurring nightmare, about Ben's secret crush, about Liam's buried resentment towards his older brother. This detail, more than any other, unnerved Liam. How could a stranger know that? The session lasted nearly 2 hours, a blur of fascination and fear. When they finally moved the planchette to goodbye, a sense of profound relief washed over them. They packed the board away, Chloe carefully wrapping it in an old linen cloth, placing it on the highest shelf of Liam's closet. They tried to laugh it off, to talk about it as a strange prank, but the undercurrent of unease lingered. It clung to them like the humid air outside. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. He swore he heard faint whispers emanating from the closet where the board was stored, just at the edge of hearing, like static on a radio. He told Liam about it the next morning, his eyes bloodshot, his face drawn. Liam, still trying to be the rational one, dismissed it as his imagination, a byproduct of being scared. But then Chloe mentioned it too, a chilling sensation of being watched from the corner of her room, even with the lights on. A sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature in her usually warm bedroom. She attributed it to the old house settling, or an overactive imagination fueled by the Ouija board. These were the first warning signs, the subtle shifts, the things that didn't quite fit, the seeds of doubt planted in fertile, young minds. They were so easy to explain away, weren't they? So easy to dismiss as post-Ouija anxiety. But what if they weren't? Over the next few days, the subtle shifts began to accumulate. They weren't dramatic, not at first. They were insidious. Liam started finding small objects moved in his room. A book on his nightstand would be on the floor, a framed photograph turned face down. He blamed himself, forgetfulness, lack of sleep. Chloe began to feel a pervasive sense of melancholy, a darkness she couldn't shake. Her vibrant energy seemed to drain, replaced by a quiet brooding. She'd sit for long periods, staring into space, a distant look in her eyes. When asked what was wrong, she'd simply say, "I just feel heavy." And Ben? Ben was the most affected. The whispers continued, evolving. They became distinct, calling his name, just barely audible. He started seeing fleeting shadows in his peripheral vision, movements that vanished when he turned to look directly. His anxiety spiraled into full-blown paranoia. He started avoiding dark rooms, refused to be alone, and constantly checked over his shoulder. He looked perpetually terrified. One evening, about a week after the session, Ben called Liam in a panic. "It's watching me, Liam. I can feel it."
It wants something. His voice was hoarse, ragged with fear. Liam, despite his remaining skepticism, couldn't ignore the genuine terror in Ben's voice. He drove over immediately. When he arrived, Ben was huddled in a corner of his living room, clutching a crucifix he hadn't held since he was a child. The air in Ben's house felt perceptibly colder, heavier, even though it was still sweltering outside. Liam could almost taste the fear in the air. This wasn't Ben's imagination anymore. This was something real. Here's what we know so far, Liam thought to himself, trying to organize the chaos. 3 friends, 1 Ouija session, a spirit named Zob, and now, a week later, escalating psychological distress and subtle but undeniable environmental disturbances. The pattern was starting to emerge, a pattern he'd later find echoed in countless other accounts. This escalation, this slow creep of dread, is a common thread in so many Ouija gone wrong stories. It's rarely a sudden explosion of paranormal activity. Instead, it's a subtle erosion of peace, a gradual intrusion that blurs the lines between reality and delusion. It makes you question your own sanity before you ever consider something else might be at play. But why Zob? Why them? Why this insidious, drawn-out torment? These were questions that began to gnaw at Liam, even as he tried to calm Ben. What had they unleashed?
And more importantly, how do you put something back once it's out? But the house wasn't done. Oh no. What began as an unsettling presence, a whisper on the edge of hearing, quickly began to spread like a creeping vine, insidious and suffocating. It wasn't content to merely hint at its existence. It wanted to be known, to be felt, to be feared. The activity deepened, becoming more targeted, more intimate. It started in the attic, yes, but soon that oppressive chill, that feeling of eyes watching, seeped through the very floorboards and into the rest of the house. First, it was the stairs. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, would ascend or descend when everyone was accounted for. Then, a new sensation joined the cacophony of unseen disturbances, a smell. Not a natural odor, but a cloying, sickly sweet aroma, like dying lilies mixed with something metallic, something like old blood or ozone after a lightning strike. It would waft through a room suddenly, so potent it made their stomachs clench, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a sterile, almost antiseptic emptiness. The objects began to move with more intent. A favorite mug would be found shattered, not dropped, but flung against a wall with force. Knives in the kitchen drawer would be subtly rearranged, their points facing outwards, towards the entryway, or sometimes, chillingly, towards the bedrooms. It wasn't just noise anymore, it was interaction, a malevolent game. Sarah would swear she felt a cold breath on her neck while brushing her teeth, or the distinct pressure of unseen fingers on her arm as she walked down a hallway, making her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house, once a sanctuary, became a vast, echoing tomb of paranoia. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became a luxury, fragmented by the sound of muffled whispers that seemed to come from inside their own pillows, or the jarring thud of something heavy dropping in a room known to be empty. They would wake in a cold sweat, convinced they'd felt a weight on their chest, a presence looming over them in the suffocating dark. Their reflections in mirrors started to seem off. A shadow would flicker just behind them, or their own eyes would appear too wide, too hollow, almost foreign. The entity, whatever it was, seemed to be learning their fears, preying on their vulnerabilities.
It didn't just cause a cold spot, it created a cold spot where they slept. It didn't just move objects, it moved their most cherished possessions. The feeling wasn't just of being watched, but of being studied, picked apart, piece by piece, as if the entity was trying on their skin, learning the shape of their carer. Every shadow held a potential threat, every creak of the old house a deliberate warning. The silence, when it fell, was the most terrifying sound of all, pregnant with unspoken malice. The incidents intensified, not just for Ben, but for Chloe and Liam too. Chloe's melancholia deepened into a profound lethargy, a constant exhaustion that no amount of sleep could remedy. She stopped eating properly, her once bright eyes now dull and sunken. She started murmuring to herself, sometimes in a voice that wasn't quite her own, a low, raspy tone whispering about being watched and taken. Liam found himself increasingly irritable, snapping at his parents, his friends. He couldn't focus. He started having vivid, disturbing dreams that left him drenched in sweat, dreams of being pursued by a formless shadow in his own home. He'd wake up feeling utterly drained, convinced he hadn't slept at all. The sense of dread was a constant companion, a cold hand on his shoulder he couldn't shake. One evening, Liam was home alone trying to read. A book slid off the shelf with a loud thud. He froze. He knew he hadn't touched it. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, even though all the windows were closed. Then, from the upstairs hallway, he heard it, a faint, almost melodic humming. It was tuneless, eerie, and undeniably present. It sounded like it was coming from his parents' bedroom, but they weren't home. He walked slowly, hesitantly up the stairs. Each step creaked ominously. The humming grew louder, still tuneless, but with an underlying rhythm that felt malevolent. It wasn't human. It wasn't natural. As he reached the bedroom door, the humming suddenly stopped. An absolute, chilling silence descended. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The window was shut. But on the pristine, neatly made bed, there was a single, perfect handprint pressed into the duvet, as if someone with a small, delicate hand had just sat there. The imprint was too deep, too perfectly defined to be accidental, and it was cold, ice cold to the touch. This was the terrifying escalation, the physical manifestation that transcended mere suggestion or psychological torment. It confirmed what Ben had been screaming, what Chloe had been muttering, and what Liam had been desperately trying to deny. Something truly malevolent had attached itself to them. The friends tried to talk about it, but their conversations quickly devolved into desperate, fearful whispers.
They researched online late into the night, looking for answers, for a way out. They found countless stories echoing their own: whispers, shadows, moving objects, feelings of dread, and the profound difficulty of making it stop. They realized the Ouija board, still wrapped in linen in Liam's closet, was the focal point. They had to get rid of it. But how? What if destroying it only angered whatever it was they had contacted? What if it freed it completely? The thought hung heavy in the air, a chilling cliffhanger to their every desperate attempt at a solution. The board was a conduit, yes, but also a cage. The creeping dread of the going deeper phase curdled into a palpable, constant terror. The friends, once a tight-knit unit, began to unravel under the relentless assault. The house no longer merely hosted activity. It became the activity, a living entity itself, twisted and hostile. Incidents grew more frequent, more aggressive, less subtle.
It wasn't just things moving. It was things being thrown with violent force. A heavy glass vase, a family heirloom, exploded against the living room wall, showering them with shards, narrowly missing Mark's head. The message was clear. This wasn't playful. It was malicious. Their pets, once a source of comfort, became indicators of terror. The family dog, a usually boisterous golden retriever, began to refuse to enter certain rooms, whimpering, pale-tucked, staring intently at empty corners as if seeing things they couldn't. Cats would arch their backs, hiss at thin air, and hide for days, their fear echoing the human's own. Sleep was a battle lost before it began. Sarah started waking with unexplained scratches on her arms, thin red lines that appeared overnight, stinging as if freshly made. David, ever the skeptic, developed a nervous tic, his eyes constantly darting to the periphery, convinced he was always being watched. They tried to cope. Oh, how they tried. They researched, burned sage, sprinkled salt, even attempted to consult with local experts who offered little more than platitudes or scams. Each attempt was met with chilling counterattacks. A cleansing ritual resulted in every light bulb in the house shattering simultaneously, plunging them into suffocating darkness, accompanied by a guttural, inhuman growl that echoed from the walls themselves. A camera set up to capture evidence would inevitably malfunction, its battery drained or its memory wiped clean, leaving behind only static and a lingering smell of burnt sugar. The attempts to document only served to highlight their helplessness. Their bonds, once so strong, began to fray. Accusations, born of sleep deprivation and paranoia, flew through the house. Did you move that? You left that door open, didn't you? The constant fear eroded trust, making them doubt not just their sanity, but each other. The texture of fear became rough, abrasive, rubbing them raw. It wasn't just about what they saw or heard. It was the suffocating sense of being utterly exposed, vulnerable, and trapped within their own home, their sanity slowly but surely being chipped away. They were prisoners, and the jailer was unseen, unheard, yet undeniably present. The decision was made. They had to destroy the board. Not just throw it away, but utterly demolish it. They chose an abandoned quarry outside Oakhaven, a place where no one went, a place that already held an atmosphere of desolation. It was a cold, moonless night, the kind where the darkness feels absolute, pressing in on you. Chloe, pale and trembling, clutched the wrapped board. Ben was a shivering wreck, muttering prayers under his breath. Liam, trying to project strength, felt his heart hammering against his ribs. They had brought gasoline and matches, intending to burn it. An old folklore remedy they'd read. As they reached the edge of the quarry, the air grew incredibly still. The usual sounds of nocturnal insects, the rustling of the leaves, everything ceased. The silence was deafening, suffocating. Then, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't human. It was an animal. It was something else entirely. Something ancient and furious. The board in Chloe's hands began to vibrate, faintly at first, then violently. The linen wrapper unraveled, revealing the polished wood, the ominous letters. The planchette, still resting on the board, began to twitch, then slid rapidly, not spelling words, but tracing frantic, jagged patterns across the surface. It was moving by itself, no hands touching it. Suddenly, the air around them dropped to an unbearable, freezing temperature. Their breath plumed out in white clouds. A thin, reedy whisper, barely perceptible, but right next to Liam's ear, hissed, "You can't escape me." The voice was cold, dry, like crumbling parchment. It was unmistakably the voice from Ben's whispers, the one Chloe heard in her delusions. Then, the true horror began. The ground around them started to shift. Not an earthquake, but something more organic, more deliberate.
clumps of earth began to rise, forming crude humanoid shapes in the darkness, outlined by the faint starlight. They were indistinct, made of soil and dead leaves, but undeniably moving, reaching. The shapes converged on Chloe, the one still holding the board. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. As the earthen figures closed in, the board erupted in a flash of sickly green light, and from it, a high-pitched, inhuman shriek tore through the night, a sound that seemed to shred the fabric of reality itself. Liam, reacting on pure instinct, wrenched the board from Chloe's grasp. He doused it with gasoline, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the can. Ben, finally breaking free of his paralysis, struck a match. The flame flared, a tiny beacon against the overwhelming darkness. As Liam tossed the match onto the gasoline-soaked board, the green light intensified, then exploded in a silent, searing white flash that momentarily blinded them. A wave of heat, then an unimaginable cold washed over them. The shriek echoed once more, fading into a long, drawn-out wail of pure agony and rage. When their vision returned, the earthen figures were gone. The ground was still. The board was a smoldering, unrecognizable pile of ash and warped wood, still faintly glowing with residual green light. The silence that followed was heavy, complete. The presence, whatever it was, felt distant. Gone? They couldn't be sure, but the immediate, suffocating pressure had lifted. The quarry loomed before them, a gaping maw in the earth, carved by ancient hands or perhaps something far older. The darkness here was not merely the absence of light, it was an active, consuming force, thick and absolute, pressing in on them from all sides. It felt heavier, colder than any night they had ever known, so profound it seemed to absorb all sound, all hope. Their flashlights, meager beams against the vast black, only served to highlight the immediate threat, casting monstrous, fleeting shadows that danced at the edges of their vision. The air was frigid, a bone-aching, pervasive chill that wasn't just from the December night, but felt unnatural, draining the very warmth from their bodies, seeping into their bones and whispering of ancient, forgotten things. The quarry walls, towering and jagged, seemed to lean in, amplifying their sense of claustrophobia despite the open air. Each breath misted visibly, a fragile plume in the biting cold. They could feel the immense weight of the rock, the depth of the water below, unseen but acutely sensed. The silence, initially unnerving, was slowly broken by the subtle, creeping sounds of the place. The trickle of unseen water somewhere deeper within the quarry, amplified and distorted, sounded like whispering voices. The shifting of loose gravel under their feet echoed unnaturally. Then, a new sound began to emerge, faint at first, then growing. A low, guttural scrape, like something vast and heavy being dragged across rough stone, followed by a wet, deliberate clicking, as if enormous teeth were slowly, methodically closing. It came from the darkest parts of the quarry, just beyond the reach of their feeble lights, a sound that carried no natural origin, only primal menace. Their own heartbeats hammered against their ribs, loud in the oppressive cold, their breath catching in ragged gasps. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce, hinting at movement in the periphery of their vision, daring them to look, to confirm the unspeakable horror slowly unfolding around them. The quarry wasn't just a location, it was a trap, a tomb, and they were caught in its ancient, icy embrace. They didn't speak on the drive home. The experience had seared itself into their very souls. When they finally reached Liam's house, they collapsed, utterly spent, emotionally and physically drained. The immediate terror had receded, but the aftermath was a different kind of horror. Chloe suffered from night terrors for months, waking up screaming about shadowy figures and the feeling of hands trying to pull her down. Her depression eventually lifted, but a quiet, watchful melancholy settled over her, a deep-seated caution she hadn't possessed before. She rarely smiled with her old abandon again. Ben struggled the most. The paranoia never fully left him. He saw therapists, tried medication, but he could never shake the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just beyond his perception. He eventually moved out of Oak Haven, seeking a fresh start, but he confided in Liam years later that he still felt it sometimes, a prickle on his neck, a sudden, inexplicable chill. Liam, the skeptic, was irrevocably changed. His rational world had been shattered. He found himself scanning shadows, jumping at unexpected sounds. He became a student of the paranormal, devouring books and online forums, trying to find an explanation, a pattern, anything to make sense of what they had endured. He couldn't shake the chilling question. What if destroying the board hadn't banished it, but merely sent it away? What if it could come back? What if it found someone else? The house itself seemed lighter after that night. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The unexplained cold spots, the faint humming, the moving objects, they stopped. But the scars on their minds were permanent. They had seen something that defied explanation, something that shattered their understanding of reality. What remains is the question of what Zob actually was. A lost soul? A trickster spirit? A demon? They never knew. The answers, if they existed, remained locked in that charred wood, buried in the dark earth of the quarry. All they had were the terrifying experiences and the chilling similarities to other stories they found, tales of quiet beginnings leading to devastating, insidious ends. This story of Liam, Chloe, and Ben, a composite of countless accounts, illustrates the disturbing patterns that emerge when Ouija boards are involved. The initial curiosity, the seeming harmlessness, the gradual escalation from psychological distress to undeniable physical phenomena, and finally the profound, lasting impact on those who dabble. These aren't isolated incidents. They are echoes across time and culture. People report an initial playful or even benevolent entity that slowly turns hostile, becoming manipulative, draining, and ultimately terrifying. The after effects are rarely immediate. They are a slow burn, a creeping infection of dread that poisons every aspect of one's life. And the most disturbing detail, the one that calls back to our very beginning, the session ends, but the story doesn't. For Liam, Chloe, and Ben, it didn't end that night in the quarry. It became part of them, a whispered memory that colored every shadow, every unexpected sound. It became a constant, nagging awareness that the veil between worlds is thinner than we dare to imagine. The burning of the board, in their case, seemed to halt the immediate attacks, to push the entity back. But for how long? And where did it go?
Did it simply find another open door, another group of curious teens, another unsuspecting individual willing to engage? That's the lingering, terrifying question, isn't it? That some things, once invited, can never truly be uninvited. They simply wait. They watch. They find a new way in. And sometimes, you don't even need a board. You just need to be open to the possibility. The darkness is always there, lurking just beneath the surface. And sometimes, all it takes is a game, a moment of curiosity, to let it step out. I want to know your thoughts on this. Have you ever had an experience that started innocently but escalated into something truly terrifying? What do you believe Zobi was, and why do you think these patterns repeat so consistently in Ouija stories? Let me know in the comments below. If these stories of the unseen and unexplained resonate with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Next week, we'll be delving into the chilling phenomenon of shadow people, the fleeting figures seen in the periphery, the silent observers that some believe are just a trick of the light, and others a much more sinister presence. Until then, keep your doors locked, your lights on, and always, always trust your gut. You never know what's waiting just beyond the edges of the familiar. Good night. Or rather, may you have a peaceful night.